All right, so we've now covered refuge, which now moves us into the next stage of the path, or the next part of the teaching. And so, as we spoke of before, the refuge is really for ourselves. It's really for finding peace ourselves, finding our own personal liberation by this connection with the divine. And as we said, of course, that has benefits for other beings just by virtue of you not being, by you being content, by you being fulfilled. Obviously, that's going to be beneficial for everyone around you, rather than you being, lost and confused or angry or anything like that. When we feel we have our own ground, when we feel we have our own refuge, then of course we radiate that in our lives. On the other hand, though, this goes a step deeper, because once we find our refuge, once we find our path, there is then, and we can approach this from many directions, but on the simplest level, there's likely to come in your heart this desire then to help other beings, this desire to help other beings come to freedom, this desire to expand this sphere of awakening and freedom to all those around you. And so this is where the Bodhicitta comes in, the enlightening mind, the awakening mind, the awakened mind. Bodhi means awake, like Buddha, and Chitta means mind, Bodhicitta. And so now, as we move towards Bodhicitta, we're turning our attention now outwards to the world, to everything around us. And we're cutting off from this pitfall, really, of just being totally self-centered in our own path of liberation, and abandoning sentient beings, abandoning our world, our mandala. And so it's a path where we're actually liberating ourselves and all beings. And so it's a very expansive path, and in that way, it is a skillful means. It's a wisdom practice as well, because by doing this, by expanding out, we're actually cutting off from this self-fixation, this preoccupation with self, and this cherishing of self over everyone else. And so by expanding our heart out and our desire for enlightenment out to more beings, then we are avoiding that pitfall of being stuck in self-clinging. And we can fall into this even in a so-called spiritual way, of just all my spiritual yumminess and all of my spiritual path, and everyone else can, get lost or find their own way. And so this is actually, it's a benevolent action, but it's also a skillful means for dealing with this fundamental ignorance we have of self, of the duality of self and other. Okay, so another point to make is that now we're really setting out on the path here, and we've taken refuge. We've cultivated this inner connection with the divine, and now we're moving our attention out to other beings. And so our whole directionality of our life has changed now, and so with refuge, we've turned away from, again, everything that we had previously talked about, that the life of hedonia, the life of just simply pursuing more stimulus and more things from the external world, which we discovered in our meditation on impermanence is so unpredictable and unstable and unreliable. And so another way to think of this as we move forward is in terms of what they call in the Buddhist tradition the 8 mundane concerns, or the 8 worldly concerns, which are basically these oscillations of things we want and things we don't want. So pleasure and pain, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, and gain and loss. So these are the factors that take place out in the world of unpredictability, the world of the lottery of outer circumstances, basically. And so as long as we are pursuing those things, then we really have no legitimate chance for happiness, because those things are always going to be changing. And if our happiness and our contentedness is going up and down with those concerns, then we're always going to be in a state of crisis and a state of anxiety and stress. On the other hand, now, if our life has now changed in this directionality where we are now all about becoming in deeper contact with the divine, purifying our minds more and more, gaining deeper stability in our meditation, more and more clarity, more and more wisdom, more and more love in our hearts. And now we are turning out to take on this bodhicitta practice of working for the benefit of all beings and working for the enlightenment of all beings. All of a sudden, that's the main point of our life. That is what is our North Star. That's the thing that we're living for. And what's great about it is that it's our ability to work for the benefit of beings and our ability to work for the enlightenment of our mind and the minds of all beings is not contingent upon any of the 8 mundane concerns. It's not contingent upon any of the outer circumstances. And of course, we need I was going to say that we need a certain level of outer circumstances to really make Dharma possible, but that's actually not true. And that might be a little bit, say, well, how's that? If I didn't, if I was in some terrible circumstance, how could I practice? Well, the fact of the matter is there were many Tibetan lamas who found themselves in Chinese concentration camps, being tortured every day, being put to use basically as slaves in labor. And some of these lamas were able to transform that time in prison into profound time of practice and retreat. And so this is the beautiful thing about these practices, is that no matter what our outer circumstances are, in other words, even if there are circumstances that if we were operating with a normal or a ordinary mind would be, oh, well, this is the end for me, this is terrible, I'm in a prison. It just is like, okay, well, now this is the arena of my practice, but my purpose of my life, which is to practice, which is to deepen my understanding, which is to deepen and expand my heart, which is to enlighten my mind and purify my mind and generate this loving kindness and compassion for all beings, and through that attain enlightenment for myself and for all beings, then there's no problem, because that is still available to us. Okay, so this is the beauty of the path of eudaimonia, the path of the Dharma, is that it's an all seasons path, and sometimes the most difficult circumstances can actually be the most fruitful for the path. So that's important to know as we go into this, that we're really moving in a totally new direction, and we're really gaining in our life a whole new understanding of why we're here and what we're all about. And now with bodhicitta, that's taking on an even deeper resonance as we move towards this desire, this wish, and eventually maybe this vow to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, to bring all beings to liberation. Okay, so let's move into bodhicitta. So bodhicitta can be broken down into 2 fundamental aspects. One is relative bodhicitta, and the other is absolute bodhicitta. And so relative bodhicitta is all of the things that we engage with on a relative level using our coarse mind, our thinking mind, things like generating loving kindness for beings, things like compassion, things like generating the vow or the wish to bring all beings to liberation, things like that. And where on the other hand, bodhicitta, the ultimate bodhicitta, is much like in refuge, how there was the relative refuge of the outer objects, and then there was the inner refuge of the true nature of being, of your true mind, pristine awareness, Buddha nature. Same thing in the bodhicitta. There are these outward relative ways that we engage with bodhicitta, but the ultimate bodhicitta is the awakened mind itself, is primordial consciousness itself, is our own pristine awareness, okay? And so those are the 2 major aspects, and we're cultivating both. So we're cultivating the realization of the ultimate, and at the same time, we are cultivating the practices that deal on the relative level. And this is one of the beautiful things about the path, and we've talked about this before, this idea of being there, recognizing the possibility of coming in contact with Buddha nature in this very moment, of pristine awareness in this very moment, while also moving along on the path, on the developmental track. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about, sudden enlightenment versus gradual enlightenment, and really, it's it's sort of a false argument, because even those who, very rarely is there anyone who just has no karma left, and they recognize the pristine awareness, and then boom, they're just completely enlightened. Usually it's a series of recognitions, this series of coming in contact with our Buddha nature. And so it's really best to look at it as both immediate enlightenment, both immediate nowness. It's right here, right now. It's always here, naturally perfect, completely complete. And on the other hand, we are moving on this path through the stages, through the different practices, and we're doing them in tandem together. And that's really what's beautiful, is we can almost look at it as like we are aligning our karma, which is everything we do, our action on the relative level. We're aligning it with the most virtuous possible path, while at the same time trying to abide as much as possible in the awareness beyond karma, in the ground of being beyond karma. And so it's almost like you are you're putting the record on, right? And then you're chilling in the chair. So you're putting the record is the record of virtue, of bodhicitta, of refuge, of virtuous action, of all the right meditations, this path of virtue, basically, this path of purification. And that's just spinning, that's happening, that's just what you do. That is the karma that you are engaging in. That is, we all have to engage in some karma, and so that is your karmic spin, that is your karmic cycle. But at the same time, you can always be resting in the armchair of pristine awareness, the armchair of your primordial being, of your primordial consciousness, of your Buddha nature, of the God mind. And so those two things can be working together. Okay, so there can be this sort of unattached expansiveness while engaging in the gradual path. Okay, so let's now turn towards the description of the relative bodhicitta, because that's mainly what we're working with here. So within relative bodhicitta, we then have two aspects: aspiring and application or engagement bodhicitta. So the aspiring bodhicitta is the wish, the aspiration to attain awakening, and attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. But it's just a wish at that point. It's like, I really want to work out. I would love for that to happen. I'm aspiring that, I will eventually be able to bring that into being. On the other hand, we then have engagement bodhicitta, where we actually make the vow, I'm going to do it. I am going to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. I'm going to bring self and other to enlightenment, and I'm going to engage in the actual practices required to do that. And in the Buddhist tradition, there's a vow you can take to actually engage in this practice, and that should be done with a qualified teacher, someone who holds the vow, and someone who is living by it. So with aspiring, that's something that, we can all basically cultivate pretty easily. This idea of, I'd love to attain enlightenment. I'd love to enlighten my mind, enlighten the minds of all beings, and move towards that. And then even with engagement bodhicitta, it's a large vow. It's a large, talk about vision, talk about aspiration, this conative intelligence. It is a major commitment to say, this is what I'm going to do. This is the purpose of my life. This is the purpose of all of my lives for all time. Like, this is the path that I am on. As long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, so too may I remain and dispel the miseries of the world. This is Shantideva, one of the great bodhisattvas' prayer, that he would always be there to return and to help beings. And that's what those who have taken on the bodhicitta vow, they don't pass into nirvana. They don't just go into their own liberation. They continually return to be of benefit to beings, okay, to be of benefit to the world. And so we can really take this on at whatever level that we feel we can at this time. There's a great story about the Dalai Lama when he first heard the teachings on bodhicitta from his teacher, from his guru. He said, I can't do this. I can't. This is too great of a task, to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, to bring all beings to enlightenment. That seems too daunting. And it actually wasn't until years later, when he was much older, that he received teachings on Shantideva's The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life from a true bodhisattva. And he said that it was due to those teachings that he truly got it and really took on bodhicitta in a serious way. So we don't have to feel bad about approaching bodhicitta in our own way. And it's actually it's good to be honest and humble about where we are with this. Now, one way to look at this also is that when we make the vow of bodhicitta, again, everything with bodhicitta is kind of this dance of skillful means and wisdom. And this is the whole dance of the Buddhist path of, skillful means and wisdom. And the skillful means in making this vow of bodhicitta, this vow to bring all beings to enlightenment, to enlighten your mind, bring all minds to enlightenment, is you can't make that vow from the seat of your conventional mind. And that's why when we think about it in that way, like me, this little being, Joe's going to, attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings and bring all beings to enlightenment. It's this huge task, and really it's craziness if you are identifying with just this individual being. On the other hand, what perspective could you make this vow from that would be authentic and true? And the answer, of course, is from the perspective of your Buddha mind, from this perspective of pristine awareness, of primordial consciousness, of your Buddha nature, okay? Because from that place, it's the possibilities are limitless. The energy is limitless. And again, of course, it is already primordially perfected. So that's really where we have to drop the line of our identification when we make this vow. And so that's important to understand, because if we maintain this perspective of just a little sentient being, a little person trying to make this vow, it can feel daunting and impossible. But again, if we drop that line down a little bit deeper into the most profound aspect of our being, then it can actually become a possibility. So that is the essence of bodhicitta. And as we approach bodhicitta and we begin to train in it, it's not like it just comes. It's a process of training. We move towards this expansive wish to bring all beings into enlightenment in stages. And so one of the main practices for coming to this desire to attain enlightenment for all beings are what are called the four immeasurables. And in the early Buddhist tradition, they're the divine abidings, divine abodes. And they are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, which means like taking joy in the success and well-being of others, rather than being jealous or resenting people for their success or their happiness. And then finally, equanimity or equality, and basically this has to do with this seeing all beings as equal and as equally deserving of happiness, equally desiring of happiness, and equal on the level of their Buddha nature, right? So by meditating on these four immeasurables, we are expanding our heart out to all beings. And by doing this, we move towards this practice of bodhicitta. We move towards this expansive heart that could desire to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So very briefly, let's go into these four immeasurables, and each one can be a meditation. But it's nice to get a little bit of an overview of them, and then we can go into them one by one and begin to train our hearts and minds in these profound practices. Okay, so we'll turn to those in the next video.